This is A Different Perspective with Kevin Randle. Kevin is a retired United States Army Lieutenant Colonel who has studied UFOs for more than 50 years. His military training has provided him with unique insight into military operations and UFO research. Kevin has investigated many of the most mysterious cases and has been consulted for dozens of documentaries and been interviewed on hundreds of radio and television programs about UFOs. Considered to be one of the leading experts on the Roswell UFO crash, Kevin has written more than 25 books about UFOs, including Roswell in the 21st Century and Encounter in the Desert, a re-examination of the Socorro UFO landing. Now here's the host of A Different Perspective, Kevin Randle.
And welcome to this edition of A Different Perspective. I'm Kevin Randle. I'm also what is known as a telephone colonel, which we'll explain later. I know that my guest is well aware of what that is. I usually have some kind of comments or rant that I get into at this part of the program, but frankly, I have nothing to complain about at the moment. So instead of doing any of that, I will introduce the guest, Colonel Richard Weaver, who is a retired U.S. Air Force colonel and former special agent of the Air Force Office of Special Investigation, as well as a retired president of an international tactical training company. In 1994, while assigned to the Pentagon, he inherited leadership of a congressionally directed audit by the General Accounting Office into what has become known as the Roswell Incident, which is why he is here today. At that time, he authored a book about that, the most compelling explanation of what happened near Roswell, in a rather benign and politically correct report. What he didn't report at the time was the chicanery, and we'll get into that, and attempted manipulation by special interest outsiders who were using the audit for their own, often less than noble purposes, which is something that I didn't know. I knew some of the behind-the-scenes connections that were going on. The book finally tells the rest of all of that story. In retirement, along with his wife of 53 years, Lynda, he has been involved in animal rescue and international travel. In my international travel, it seems like every time I went someplace, people were shooting at me, which kind of turned me off to international travel. They have 2 children, 5 grandchildren, and 7 great-grandchildren, and live somewhere in the southeastern United States. His book is called Backstory, Roswell, Exclusive Untold Disclosures about the 1994 Air Force Roswell Report. Colonel Weaver, welcome to A Different Perspective.
Kevin, thank you very much. I'm glad I was able to join you today.
I think it's going to be a fun and illustrative conversation that we'll have here. I'm going to explain telephone colonel to them. Colonel Weaver is a full colonel, what we call a bird colonel, an 06. I, on the other hand, am a lieutenant colonel, which is an 05. And we're called telephone colonels because we are authorized to answer the telephone as Colonel so-and-so. Although in the last few years, I've noticed that an awful lot of lieutenant colonels do, in fact, answer the phone Lieutenant Colonel so-and-so. Which reminds me of an interesting story. Back when I was in the Air Force as an intelligence officer, actually the director of intelligence at in O'Hare, we had to destroy classified materials periodically. I mean, they were out of date. There were things that we did not need. They had to be destroyed because they were classified. And I would call over to the Great Lakes Naval Air Station, and I would introduce myself as Captain Randle, and they would get very excited because a captain in the Navy is equivalent to a bird colonel in the Air Force, until they found out I was an Air Force captain, which is the equivalent of a lieutenant in the Navy, so they were less than impressed. But it's just how things worked out in the telephone and the variations between the branches. As I mentioned, Colonel Weaver, and we can colonel each other to death here just for fun.
Yeah, why don't you call me Rich instead?
Well, obviously, I'm just being kind of facetious. I remember the scene from one of the movies on the Alamo where they had Colonel Travis and Colonel Bowie and Colonel Crockett, and they said, well, we could just colonel each other to death here. What intrigued me about your book was some of the backstory that went on there. Can you just briefly kind of fill me in some of the maneuvering that went on behind the scenes that became the Roswell investigation as you did it.
Yeah, sure. What happened originally is, of course, like everything in the military, we inherited this as a duty, as a task. Whether we wanted to or not, we happened to be in the office that was responsible for that. And the General Accounting Office decided they were going to conduct an audit of, I don't know, they changed the name of it 3 different times. So something having to do with Roswell, okay, is how it ended up. And so we became the sticky office in the Pentagon for the Air Force anyway, because other services were also involved. And as we went through our tasks, trying to put together to answer the purpose of the audit, we found out that this just wasn't quite as straightforward and up and coming as it seemed, and there was a lot of politics and a lot of manipulation going on behind the scenes in an attempt to somehow come to a foregone conclusion by other people, and that there had been some manipulation both of the GAO and other government agencies by an unorganized, I think, group of outsiders who had their own agenda and were trying to seek their own opinions.
Let's clarify a little bit. Let's clarify a little bit, because the GAO just didn't decide to investigate Roswell. There was pressure put on by a New Mexico congressman named Schiff.
That's right.
And he was the one that kind of initiated the idea that the GAO should be investigated. And I think you're suggesting here that there were people in his office and people that he knew that had manipulated him into making the request.
Yeah, that's right. Schiff was a congressman from the Albuquerque area in New Mexico. And amongst the people on his staff, including one of his highly placed staffers, was also the wife of one of the more noted at the time UFO researchers, and she ended up kind of in charge of some of this efforts. Now, this was all unknown to us originally at the time, of course, but as we went through, we started learning about, every time we turned around, these other people meaning Schiff and his staffers and people that were trying to influence Schiff, had their fingers in the Roswell pie. And we couldn't report that in our government report, because that was not our task. Our job was to make this as truthful and as politically correct as possibly could be, so we didn't step on any toes, which is what we had attempted to do.
Now, when you talk about these other people, you're referring specifically to Carl Flock, I believe, who was a member of the Fund for UFO Research at the time and had been investigating the Roswell case on his own for some time when all of this began.
Yeah, he was certainly one of the major shakers and movers in this whole effort. In fact, he gloated in a number of writings that I outline in my book, how he was working behind the scenes to influence this, which is, by the way, not illegal or even immoral, certainly by DC standards, where apparently nothing is. But he was well involved in this, which is kind of interesting, because at the same time he was conducting his own research and overlapped many of the areas that we ultimately looked into.
Well, Carl Flock had always wanted to be a writer, I think, or had a desire to be a writer. And he first surfaced in the world of the UFO during the cattle mutilations in the 1970s, early 1980s. And he was working with a fellow in Colorado Springs, whose name escapes me and is irrelevant to this. But he met 2 writers who were doing a book on cattle mutilations called Mute Evidence, a fellow named Kagan and a fellow named Summers. They met in Colorado Springs, and Flock introduced himself as Kurt Peters. And he was writing a book about, or trying to gather information about cattle mutilations as well. But Summers and Kagan already had a contract with Bantam Books, so it kind of put him on the outside. But he sort of tried to insert himself into their investigation at the same time, and I don't think it went very well. And that's kind of some of the background on Flock. But the other thing I wanted to mention is Carl Flock had told us, and by us I mean Don Schmidt and me, and the members of the Center for UFO Studies, that the Roswell crash was the result of an N9M flying wing. That was a precursor to the XB-35, which is the big flying wing that you sometimes see in, well, you would have seen in the the early War of the Worlds movie back in 1953.
Right.
And then he moved on to other arenas in that. So Flock is, I guess you would say, he was well versed in ufology when he began to bug Congressman Schiff about doing something on the Roswell case. Am I getting that in the right order there?
I think so, because when this originally started, we had no idea who Carl Flock even was, and had never even actually heard of him at all, because in our particular office, UFOs was not something that we looked into, or the Air Force even looked into. And so we were blissfully unaware of his existence for the early part of our efforts. And but every time we turned around, his name popped up. Now, he was, as you know, he also had a rather decent background in his own right in government. And, so he had some good credentials as far as on paper of, being kind of a stand-up guy. But every time we turned around, he had his figures in the pie trying to manipulate something. And as we went through this whole thing and learned more about him, including studying his writings that he had available, we never really could figure out what his agenda really and truly was. And I mentioned that in my book under a chapter called "What the Flock is Going On." But he was always kind of an enigma in the whole thing.
I think his agenda was to become a writer. And I know that he had at one time been an editor. I don't remember, was it a magazine or a small publishing house? He wanted to write science fiction as one of the things he wanted to do. I mean, I knew Carl Flock. I'd met him many, many times. In fact, he and I did an article on Barney Barnett, which was the Plains of San Augustine witness to part of the crash back in the International UFO Reporter, where we determined that if Barnett was referring to a UFO crash, it had nothing to do with Roswell. It was something else. And we're not sure that Barnett didn't make up the whole thing based on the Aztec crash, but that's a whole nother story. So I think Flock's motivation was to become a writer. And this was one of the paths he took to achieve that goal, was to insert himself into this investigation and become an important part of the Roswell story.
Well, we were certainly unaware of that at the time, and actually I was not aware that, I knew he had written a number of books subsequent to that, but I had no idea at that specific time that he had the desire to be a writer. I did know from a letter that he wrote to Cabot that he was looking forward to making money by writing books, because he made that statement in the letter to Cabot.
Well, let me point out to those who don't know, Cabot is Sheridan Cabot. He was the counterintelligence guy in Roswell in 1947. Later became a member of the Air Force Office of Special Investigation and ended his career as another telephone colonel, Lieutenant Colonel Cabot. We're going to have to take a quick break here, and when we come back, we'll explore this a little bit more and then move on to other arenas in which this all took place. I do want to thank those of you who have purchased the Best of Project Blue book. It's been up and down the Amazon bestseller list. If you enjoyed it, please rate it and write a review. It helps to spread the word. I try to be very, very neutral in my word, but sometimes my bias takes over, as I think it does with everybody. And be sure to take a look at Encounter in the Desert about Socorro and Roswell in the 21st century. And of course, Colonel Weaver's book, which we'll mention when we come back right after this. So please stick around. here with Colonel Richard Weaver, whose claim to fame for us, anyway, was he was the senior leader on the Air Force investigation into the Roswell case. And as I promised before, his book is called Backstory, Roswell, the exclusive untold disclosures about the 1994 Air Force Roswell report. When we went away, we were kind of talking about Carl Flock and his manipulation of the situation. And did he, I guess what I'm casting about for, did he exert any direct influence on your investigation, or I mean, did he contact you personally, or did you just learn about him through other areas?
No, I never had any contact with him at any time during that or subsequent to that, or nor did any other members that I'm aware of my staff that were involved in putting together the original 1994 report. So basically what we learned about him, we learned through other people talking with us because he was simultaneously writing a book himself about Roswell, and but we never had any interaction with him at all.
I always felt that he chose the path he did on the Roswell case, and this is from my discussions with him, is that he wanted to do a book about Roswell, but when he came to the table, there was already the Roswell Incident by Charles Berlitz and William Moore. Don Schmidt and I had sold a book to Avon, which they cleverly called the UFO Crash at Roswell. That was not the title we had. There was Friedman doing his book with Don Berliner called Crash at Corona, and when he got to the table, those places were pretty much full. The only thing he could do was come at it from the negative point of view, and I think that switched his opinion about the Roswell case, that it was based not merely on the evidence that he saw, but on what was available for him to do, where he could go and publish a book that wasn't going to be something that would be lost in the clutter of all the other Roswell books.
Well, that's certainly very possible, and I'm familiar with all the other books that you just mentioned, which, of course, including yours and Don Schmidt's, and you had two of them up. I think one came out in 1994, your second one. And we actually used all those materials because we were not pro-UFO guys or anti-UFO guys. We weren't UFO guys. So most of us, the only thing that we knew about Roswell, quite frankly, is what we had seen on television or garnered through a haphazard reading of one of those other books. So when this came up, we went to those books and a lot of the other writings that came out in UFO journals to find out exactly what some of the issues are, because we needed more information than the GAO had provided to us in order to go out and try and do a diligent search for the records that they claimed to be looking for. So, and of course, we had no contact with any of those other writers personally either, I mean, including yourself at that time. And
when you say that, McAndrew called me a number of times. I talked to McAndrew a number of times. And I don't know if he talked to any of the other writers, but he talked to me a number of times.
If he did, if you say he did, I believe you 100%. But if he did, it probably had to do with the subsequent book that he authored, which came out after the Roswell report, the original tome that I was responsible for writing. McAndrew stayed on at the Pentagon in the historian's office and then subsequently wrote another book. And I think that's probably when he had contact with you. And by that time, I had gone on to other pastures and was not, I was aware that he was writing the book and I had talked to him about it, but I wasn't aware of the ins and outs of what he was actually aiming toward or who he might have talked to.
Well, he actually wanted me to admit that I was in it for the money. And that was his big push. You can tell me that you're in it for the money. That's all that matters to me. And I'm thinking, no, I'm not in it for the money. I had a very nice career going writing science fiction and action adventure books. And this kind of derailed part of that because we got so involved in the investigation. Don Schmidt and I made many, many trips to Roswell and other places to talk to witnesses. And that seemed to be his theme was you're just in it for the money. Now, I know before we had the break, you had mentioned just briefly that Sheridan Cavett had a letter from Carl Flock, which said basically he was in it for the money. Did that influence
your... What does that affect?
Did that influence your opinion of all the people who were involved in the Roswell investigations, which would include Don Schmidt and me and Don Berliner and Stan Friedman and some of the others who were doing the investigations? Did that kind of set a blanket tone for all of us?
No, not really. That's the only direct, I mentioned that in my book, the only direct claim that somebody had about the money. And by the way, there's nothing wrong in making money writing a book. Although some people took it to a new high, and you probably can imagine who I'm talking about there. That's not you and Don Schmidt. But
well, at least in our book, we tried to keep to the evidence. We didn't make stuff up.
Yeah, but what we were looking at there is there was other claims where other people had written letters to other people, and these all existed where they were bragging, if you will, about how they were involved with getting this whole thing started with Congressman Schiff and ultimately the GAO, and as kind of a collective group. Now that didn't strike me as being a highly organized conspiracy. It just is a bunch of guys that had a common interest in trying to get the government to do some of the work for them. And those are claims that other people made that we didn't make. But nevertheless, we went on with our own work because we had more than enough to do just searching for the records that they wanted to look for.
When we were doing our investigation, it's Don Schmidt and I, we looked into the backgrounds of many of the people to make sure that what they were telling us were legitimate. We got fooled a couple of times. Frank Kaufman springs to mind immediately.
All right.
But we also had a interview done by Bob Pratt, who worked for the National Enquirer. And I always hesitate to say that because Pratt was very conscientious in doing his UFO articles for the Enquirer. He wanted to make sure the information was accurate. And he was I think he edited the MUFON Journal for a while and has did a couple of books on UFOs and became an important player in the MJ-12 nonsense that blew up in the 1980s. But I'm just wondering about how all of this. How did you decide who you were going to talk to? And by that I mean, what I was thinking there was Pratt was the one who interviewed Jesse Marcel first. He
Correct.
did the interview that I think we all had the 8 pages from that some of the problems arose. And I know that you looked into some of Marcel's background. What all did you find when looking at Marcel's background?
Well, the first question you ask is who did we decide to talk to? And the answer was we had no real charter to actually talk to anybody because in the way it was tasked, we weren't supposed to go forth and basically redo everything that everybody had ever written about Roswell. Our job was to go through and find out what the Air Force may have had or did have on Roswell pertaining to records. And we were coming up really, really short, like 0. And but we wanted to be as thorough as possible, so we said, well, let's look at this as we would a criminal investigation, being an OSI agent, and go back and look at the people who were involved in this thing who are still in the Air Force, because we just couldn't willy-nilly take off and start interviewing people all over the country because we had no charter to do that. So we looked at the people that were still alive, and they were dwindling almost daily by that may have had some direct personal knowledge of what may have happened at Roswell. And of course, person number one involved in that was Jesse Marcel. And we were aware of what he claimed through the interview that Pratt did with him, and a number of other folks had talked with him.
Did you have a copy of the Pratt interview?
Yes, we did.
So you know that it was just basically one big long paragraph.
Yes.
It was a little bit hard to determine, and Carl, when he printed in his book, cleaned it up. And there's one point where the insertion of a comma changes the statement. And it was about Marcel claimed, I think on his third flight in the Pacific War, he had to bail out. The plane was shot down and he had to bail out. And Pratt asked him if all survived, and he said, all but one crashed into a mountain. And if you insert a comma in there, it becomes all survived, but one guy who crashed into a mountain. And if you leave the comma out, it sounds like everybody but one crashed into the mountain. And I know when Carl wrote his book, he inserted the comma. And so I think that part of the problem was the interpretation of the Pratt interview. I called Pratt about that and asked him if he still had the tape, and he said no, because they reused the tapes frequently, so we couldn't get a read on exactly how these things developed. But I think part of the problem arose from the way Pratt transcribed the interview.
Yeah, and that's certainly possible, and I'm familiar with that controversy. Although I wasn't at the time in 1994 when we had a copy of the interview. We just had what was available, which came out of the National Enquirer. But I know that's been a matter of some contention since then. What got our attention with Jesse Marcel was not just that claim. He had a whole bunch of claims that did not ring true. We pulled it and then went through every single piece of paper in his entire military records, as we did with a number of other people, and I list those folks in the book. And they were all folks that had been in the Air Force at Roswell or related to Roswell in 1947. So we had direct access to those records. And Marcel, who had a good career in his own right, he was a good soldier, so to speak, who did his duty like many of the other people during World War II. But by the time he or other people who were writing about him at the time got through, he did a whole lot more than his records could ever account for, including being a pilot and shooting down 5 airplanes and all sorts of claims that could not be established. And I go over those in detail in my book, and I know you've gone over them yourself by reviewing his records, as has Phil Class and other folks. So,
well, let's take a break here. Let's take a break here and come back to Marcel and some of his claims, because I think it's all in the matter of how you interpret what he said and how it came out in that interview. And I think it's important to understand the interpretations and the way these things went, because unfortunately it's not as black and white as it could be. There's some areas of gray in there, although there are some embellishments in Marcel's discussion of what he'd seen and done that deserve, I think, to be underscored here. So we'll do that when we come back. I am here with Colonel Richard Weaver, who we've blamed for the Roswell investigation, and I know you've been attacked for some of your opinions based on what you've said, and I'm sure that most of that is unfair. The book is Backstory Roswell, Exclusive Untold Disclosures about the 1994 Air Force Roswell Report. Take a look at mine, Roswell in the 21st Century, and I think you'll find some areas of agreement between what Rich and I have written about that. So when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about Marcel. You are listening to A Different Perspective on the X-Zone Broadcast Network. We will be back right after this, so please stick around. As I say, I'm here with Rich Weaver, but to make it clear, we are not in the same room. We are not in the same state. We are practicing social distancing. I say that each time so people know that we're not violating anybody's directives on how we can remain safe. When we went away, we were kind of talking about Jesse Marcel, and there are some problems with Jesse Marcel. I think some of it is the result of misinterpretations of the Pratt interview. I think some of it is what Jesse Marcel himself said. But one thing that caught me in your book, you said you couldn't find the citation for Marcel's Bronze Star. Is that correct?
Yeah, we could not. We found we found the write-up for it, which is the same as I think 14 other people. Don't hold me to that number, but where they just blanket gave these out for to a bunch of people, which is not unusual during that period of time. But we could not find the actual write-up for it. We found the citation where what it claimed, but it was really pretty generic.
Did you find
aerial flight during hostilities and this type of thing?
Did you find the general order? Is what you're telling me? The general order number 672?
Yeah, we never found that. We went a number of places looking for it with the Air Force Historical Research Agency and folks.
This is my big gotcha for you because I have a copy of it. I found
you mentioned it earlier. That good catch.
It was in the unit history. I had ordered a copy of the unit history, and I went through the unit history. I actually found a picture of Marcel briefing the flight crews. And so I have General Order number 672, dated 3 May 1945. I also found another copy. It was dated 9 May 1945. And as you say, it's just generic. It says, by direction of the President, under the provisions of Executive Order number 9419, 4 February 1944. And it gives some other stuff like that. A Bronze Star Medal is awarded by the Commanding General, the Far East Air Forces, to the following officer and enlisted men, but it's only got one name. It says to Captain Jesse A. Marcel, Air Corps, United States Army, for meritorious achievement. I think you deduced it was for meritorious achievement in connection with the military operations against the enemy in the Southeast Pacific from 15 January 1944 to 1 November 1944. So I managed to find that, but I went through the unit history to get that. I was looking for the air medals and anything that would suggest he'd shot down 5 enemy planes. And I'm thinking that he may have said to Pratt that he had 5 air medals, and he mentioned shooting down 1 enemy plane. And I'm thinking Pratt might have thought he got an air medal for each time he shot down an enemy plane.
Yeah, I don't know. There was absolutely no record of anything. It'd be a pretty big deal for an intelligence officer who's not rated to shoot down 5 enemy airplanes, not the least of which, as I go through in the book, would make him an ace, which he would have been a standalone guy. And I list the other guys in that theater of service during World War II that shot down, and most of them were tail gunners or waist gunners or whatever, which you'd expect. But in addition to fighter pilots, which of course shoot down the most of the planes, he claimed to be flying on a B-24, if I remember correctly.
I think it was B-24s. And the other point of contention is I don't think he ever really said he was a pilot. I think he said he flew as a pilot, which is a different thing. I think it's a matter of semantics that we're dealing with here. And it may be an unimportant matter of semantics, but I don't think that when he said he flew as a pilot, I could say legitimately I flew as a door gunner in Vietnam. You'll find nothing in my records to suggest I was trained as a door gunner or anything else. I was a helicopter pilot and an aircraft commander, and at one point we had to fill in a number of slots, and I took one of the slots as a door gunner a couple of times. So I flew as a door gunner, but you'll find nothing in my record to support that. And I think, well, you know that as well as I do, Rich, that sometimes you fill into positions and it doesn't really show up in your records or anything like that. And talked about being shot down one time, and there's nothing in his records to support that. And I'm thinking, I blew up a helicopter on a landmine, and you'll find nothing in my records to support that. But if you go to the 187th Assault Helicopter Company website and look at the unit history, you'll find out on, I think it's May 16th, 1969, I blew up a helicopter on a landmine. So, some of that criticism I think was a little bit unfair toward Marcel, and I'm not accusing you of it. A lot of people have done the same thing.
Yeah, well, but what I'm saying is, in his records, there was, even if it was nothing in his flight records, there was nothing to show that he was ever trained in any way in anything having to do with flight, and the only weapon that he was familiar with that was he was even qualified to carry was a .45 pistol, which is what you would expect for an intelligence officer. There, they don't.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But in the unit history again, looking through that, I know he did receive 2 air medals, and you acknowledge that in the book as well.
Yes.
I could only find 2, and I always thought what's the difference between 2 and 5? I mean, what's the big deal? There was a general officer who had 125 air medals. In the Vietnam War, you got an air medal for every 25 hours of combat assault flight time. So a lot of us racked up a large number of air medals, so it wasn't a big deal.
Yeah, well, it was for you because you got them the old-fashioned way by actually going an aerial flight in combat. And you and I both know guys that just rode along as frequent flyers so they could say they got an X number of hours on there so they could get an air medal even though they had nothing to do with their mission or anything else. They just wanted an air medal. But
wouldn't you think,
the system.
But wouldn't you think as an air intelligence officer, by riding along on some of those missions, it would have helped him in his intelligence work? I mean, you can see it being a necessary thing to do.
I certainly wouldn't preclude it, and obviously he must have because he did get 2 air medals. So you don't get those without being in an airplane, and so he obviously flew it at some point. Now what he was doing is unknown. It's whether he was just going back and forth or whether he was actually gainfully working on an intelligence officer task, which is highly possible. I'd give him credit for that as a possibility. But I'm saying that's just not the only thing in his record that was a little bit suspect. His education all sorts of things.
We'll get into that in just a minute. Let me say one other thing. In the unit history, it said he had 485 hours of flight time. That's in the unit history. Documented in the unit history, 485 hours of flight time. And you know as well as I do, these bomber missions could last for I was going to say literally days, 14, 15 hours. So it wouldn't take long before he could run up a whole bunch of stuff. So I think that was the reason he was participating in the missions and probably in official capacity. But that's really not some of the major issues. He said that he had 3,000 hours, I think, of pilot time. I found nothing to suggest he had an FAA certificate. I found nothing to suggest he had any kind of rating in the military. And I, as a military pilot, I don't even have 3,000 hours of pilot time. So I found that could be suspect. I looked into his education, and I think, as we all did, he had a year and a half at Louisiana State University, LSU.
Right.
But he claimed. And I'm not sure how he got that, because there seems to be a little bit of a problem with that, although it's mentioned in his military record. But he mentioned in the Pratt interview he'd gotten some kind of a degree from, I think, George Washington University, and they seem to have no record. I wondered if there was a program, and you know as well as I do, that oftentimes soldiers would take advantage of courses at the local universities while they're serving in duty, sort of an outreach program like that. I asked George Washington about that, and they had no record that he had attended anything like that, so it kind of shot that in the foot. So we had some problems with getting into his background. I mean, you found other instances as well?
Well, basically, there was nothing that we didn't dwell on his education. We were looking at the military thing. Now, other people, including Phil Klass and Robert Todd, got his records, and they pointed out the education thing. By the way, in our original report, the Roswell report, which was actually never written to be a book, it was written to be a report for the Secretary of the Air Force and not for public dissemination. But we never mentioned anything about Marcel or any of those people by name, because we didn't want to. If we did, we'd have to point out the discrepancies in there, and we didn't want it to look like we were trying to shoot the messenger to go after the claimants rather than go after the information. So we didn't mention anything about any of those folks, including we looked for Frank Kaufman's records, and we looked at Cabot's records, and we looked at Blanchard's records, and we looked at all those people that we could, that had some kind of firsthand claim to whatever it was they found or thought they found at Roswell, or handled the information. Newton. So we didn't mention any of those folks in the original book, and that I mentioned them now in my other book because it's not a government publication. The original book again was written very succinct and stilted way, because that's the way you write in the Air Force, especially when you write to the secretary, and to get a senior officer to read anything more than 2 pages long is difficult, because that's kind of the standard. And so we give them like a 30-page thing. That's asking them to read War and Peace, and that's really, really unusual. So we had to cut it back as succinct as possible and still contain all the appropriate information, and putting nitpicky stuff about any of the people involved in there just was not something that you do in an official report.
But the fact that we found, and I say we because Don Schmidt and I found discrepancies as well with Marcel's record, tends to harm his reputation as a source to what he had seen in Roswell in 1947.
Well, it certainly did to us, because what we found, and I think to be fair to Marcel, other than making the statement, what he found was, quote, not of this world or not of this earth, is a long way from saying what we found was a flying saucer full of aliens, because I know of no case that he specifically said that. But it became implied or inflated over time that that's what he was talking about. But I don't think he made those claims firsthand. He certainly never made them officially to anybody, because there's no record of him talking to anybody about it in the Air Force records.
He, I think, was talking about metallic debris, and metallic debris is basically metallic debris. You need something more to move it into the realm of the extraterrestrial. According to one of Marcel's relatives, and I don't buy this story at all, but he told the relative that he had seen bodies of alien creatures. I don't believe that. I think if he'd seen alien bodies, he would have. The only person he would have told was his son, and Jesse Marcel Jr. was quite clear that his father never mentioned alien bodies. So I think Marcel stuck pretty much to the idea he was on the debris field. He saw this metallic debris. This is what he observed of its properties, but he didn't take it beyond that. And I think that we need to make that pretty clear. We're going to have to take another break. There's so much to get into here. There's Project Mogul. There's MJ-12. There's Frank Kaufman, whom you've mentioned. There's Irving Newton, who was the weather officer. The pictures taken in General Ramey's office of the debris. The Ramey memo we need to talk about.
Sure.
Because these are all interesting parts of the phenomenon, and it all relates to what we come back with our opinions of the Roswell case. So when we come back, we'll try to explore some of that in a little bit more coherent way, which is my fault, nobody else's. You're listening to A Different Perspective on the X Zone Broadcast Network. We'll be back right after this, so please stick around. I am here with Colonel Richard Weaver. We're talking about the Air Force investigation into the Roswell case, which was kind of a misnomer, I guess, that they really weren't investigating the Roswell case, but investigating the paperwork surrounding it and that sort of thing, and some of the things they found. There's so much to get into, and I'm not sure where we want to go here. With Jesse Marcel, I think it's important to mention a couple of things here. One is, I'm sure you didn't see Lynda Corley's book on Marcel, For the Sake of My Country, which was written long after you did your report. And the reason I bring this up, there's something in that book that bothers me immensely, and it's this deal. Marcel would be telling a story about how he had performed an appendectomy over the radio. This surgeon guiding him as he performed the appendectomy on a soldier who was very, very ill, gravely ill. And as he started to tell that story to Lynda Corley, his wife, Vo Marcel, broke in and said, "Oh, not that again," which suggests that he told the story frequently, but she may not have been that enamored with it. I don't know if you'd seen that or not, but
of course, we did not see it at the time. I'm familiar with the book because I've read the book subsequently to that. But yeah, that did kind of jump out at you in there as being like, that's a little bit weird. But I am familiar with it.
Well, there's something else that I'm going to jump to, and I didn't mean to jump to it at this point, but it just sprung up. You had done in your book, at the end of the book, the last part, you did a thing on stolen valor and people who have good careers in the military, people who had no careers in the military, talking about these heroic events they were participants in. And you mentioned three examples. I would mention the publisher of the Arizona Republic, or one of the two major newspapers in Phoenix, Arizona, used to attend formal functions in an Air Force dress uniform and claimed to have been involved in some very hairy things, right up until the time he was outed as never having served in the military. You wonder why someone who was a distinguished publisher would do that. And more importantly, there was a judge in Illinois a number of years ago who claimed to have the Medal of Honor. He had earned it in 1959 in the Navy. Well, the Navy at that time, and I don't know if they still do, would award the Medal of Honor to heroic acts that took place in peacetime, saving lives in a very heroic fashion, and that's what he claimed. He was outed when he tried to get Medal of Honor license plates for his car, and they discovered there was no record of it. This guy was a judge, for crying out loud, doing that. And so we have a lot of people in the military who embellish their careers somewhat, and I think Jesse got caught up in some of that because he did I guess you'd say a workman's job as an intelligence officer in the southeastern Pacific during the Second World War, but he didn't do anything really heroic other than his job in a bad environment.
Yeah, and I do give him credit, certainly in the book, is that if he would have left out all that stuff, he would have had a fully successful Air Force / Army Air Corps career in his own right. He wasn't a rock star, but he was a good, solid officer, and nobody can take that away from him. But when he started embellishing it, that goes to, at least in my case, to his credibility.
Yeah, it harms his credibility. Doesn't mean that what he said about the debris and that sort of thing is untrue or embellished. It just harms it. You need additional information. You need additional evidence to accept that as being legitimate. I wanted to mention, you mentioned Frank Kaufman, and Frank Kaufman was a guy, and this really impacts the whole Roswell story in a great deal. I learned of Frank Kaufman from Walter Haut being the press public affairs officer at Roswell in 1947. And Frank Kaufman told a number of stories, and he presented his separation papers to Don Schmidt and me. I have a copy of them. Said he was a master sergeant, was trained in intelligence, and he was involved in the retrieval operation in New Mexico. And you say you looked into his background and couldn't find records?
Right. In St. Louis, he had not record one that we were able to locate. And that's not unusual given in that his records would have been stored in an area that was hit by the catastrophic fire that went through there some years ago. And we only found one. We did find one Frank Kaufman, as I mentioned in the book. It was one in. It was a dental record, or a portion of a dental record for another man who was not the person we're talking about, and that was it. I mean, because that area had been heavily destroyed by that fire.
Well, it's going to sound like I'm criticizing the work you guys did, but it's that you had a limited tasking, and we had access to an awful lot of other people who wanted to help in the investigation. We found Kaufman's original separation papers.
In St. Louis? Oh,
well, no. I would suspect that Mark Rodecker, Mark Chesney, and Don Schmidt found them. After Frank had died, his wife, very nice woman, Juanita, had asked them to go through his personal papers to make sure he did not have some contractual agreement that he had not fulfilled that needed to be taken care of in relation to appearances on TV and that sort of thing. And I think that's where they found the original separation paper. And we learned that he was a staff sergeant and that he had been trained in administration, and the original document he gave us was a complete and total fabrication.
Right. And just similar to the guy I used in the book who claimed he had the Medal of Honor, and then his family, finds this citation, and the guy never had the Medal of Honor, and he never gained anything from it. But he had this thing all written up, claiming to be this rock star hero in his safe deposit box, and his family immediately believed it. Now, we assume that he's the one that penned the thing in the first place for whatever reason we never knew, but I think Kaufman did a little bit of that in his own right, because he was basically a clerk. Yeah,
Kaufman did a lot of that, but here's how it relates to Roswell. Is we got it from Walter Hott, and I remember standing on Main Street in Roswell, New Mexico, across from the Greyhound bus station, and asking Walter, "Can we believe what Frank Kaufman tells us?" And his response to me and Don Schmidt was, "Everything he tells you is golden." What does that now tell us about Walter Hott? Because we now know that Kaufman was making the stuff up. And that harms Walter Hott's reputation as well. And you wonder about the manipulation that was going on there that impacts the entire Roswell case. And for those of you who'd like much more detail on this, I'll use this to plug my book, which was Roswell in the 21st Century. I detail that in the book about Walter Hott and Frank Kaufman and how we got to Kaufman and why we believed Kaufman in the very beginning. I also believed the people who were military telling me the truth, because I had not read Stolen Valor at that point and discovered we got all these people making up crap about what they'd done in the military when they hadn't been there, they hadn't done anything, and some of them hadn't been in the military.
Yeah, so absolutely. Yeah.
It's a very frightening thing in that respect. So you found nothing with Kaufman, but you didn't say anything in your report because it was really irrelevant to what you were doing.
Yeah, I mean, we couldn't find any information about him one way or another, and we did. Of course, he showed up in your book at the time, and we didn't mention that either. Well, we went through and looked at his claims in there, and we're going like, "Wow, this is just not tracking in our book." But we never mentioned it in the book, and it didn't affect anything that we wrote, other than if I hadn't written my subsequent book, which is out now, nobody other than that you found would probably even know about it. But he became, as far as we were concerned, just a total non-player in the whole thing.
Absolutely. I think that Phil Klass and Carl Flock rejected him because they didn't like what he was saying. They didn't have evidence that he was lying at that time. They just didn't like it, so they rejected his testimonies. Once we discovered the truth, I made sure that got published immediately, because I just wasn't going to sit with that information in the background. I know that Mark Rodiger and Mark Chesney and Don Schmidt were hesitant to publish the information because they didn't want to embarrass Juanita unfairly. And they should be commended for that, but I thought the information should get out immediately and made sure that it did.
Yeah, I'm certainly on your side on that.
But I can understand their rationale as well. So that kind of deals with Frank Kaufman. We haven't gotten to Project Mogul, which I think is very important that we need to discuss. We haven't talked about MJ-12, which really harms everything that we're discussing. I'm going to talk about some of the things that Cavett had said and done, which I think is important as well. Because Cavett flat-ass lied to us, but there's an incident that took place in Sierra Vista, Arizona, when Don and I visited him there that I think is important to understanding his mindset and what was going on. Your book covers a lot of this background into how the Air Force was dragged into this investigation and how it came about, and some of the backroom dealings that went on. I think it's important to understand that as well. And it may seem like it's overly detailed and might be somewhat boring, but to someone like me who's into the minutia of Roswell, I think it's very important to understand some of that was going on and how this all came about, that it sort of detracts from the legitimacy of Roswell. And I'll make this one comment with Glenn Dennis. The videotapes that we had collected of Glenn Dennis ended up in the National Archives that had been supplied to, I think, probably to McAndrew. And they're now available on YouTube. And it annoys me because it looks like it's interviews conducted by the government, by the Air Force with Glenn Dennis, and they're not. And I've tried to get them either taken down as being copyright infringement because of that. I don't care that they're up there. I just do not like the way it's listed up there because it makes it look like they're much more important than they were. And we know that Glenn Dennis was not telling the truth either. Rich, your book is Roswell, Exclusive Untailed Disclosures about the 1994 Air Force Roswell Report. Mine is Roswell in the 21st Century, which covers, I think, it from the whole thing from a different perspective. Right. Talking about what I've learned about it, treating Roswell as a cold case and doing the investigation beginning around 2010 and looking at all of that material so that we get a better look at it. We're going to do another hour here with Colonel Weaver, talking about the points we didn't get to: Project Mogul, MJ-12, some of the other investigations that went on in the background that are important to understanding how this whole thing came about, and providing insight into how things developed and who was legitimate and who was not. And one of the things I'll try to remember to get into is there was some documentation or writings about the Roswell case prior to the Roswell Incident and Jesse Marcel coming out in 1978. There were mentions of the Roswell case. Frank Edwards mentioned it in his book, Flying Saucer Serious Business. He got most of the stuff wrong, other than it happened in Roswell and a rancher found the material. Other than that, everything is wrong, but it is a mention of the Roswell case, specifically prior to that stuff coming out. There was a story written by Inez Wilcox, wife of Sheriff Wilcox of Roswell in 1947, that we don't know exactly when it was written. I suspect it was after 1980, but we don't know that for sure. But I think it's important to understand some of the Roswell case as well. So as I say, Colonel Weaver and I are going to return here, in essence, next week, talking about more of this. And I'll try to not talk quite so much and let Colonel Weaver talk a little bit more so that you can get his perspective on this. You have been listening to A Different Perspective on the X-Zone Broadcast Network. We'll be back in 167 hours, so thank you for tuning in.